A frosty dawn, a silent garden, and a secret buried for decades. Until now. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Share where you're tuning in from. Your voices bring these mysteries to life. Let's dive in. A warm September sun lay over the village of Little Bramble, softening the edges of the whitewashed cottages and gilding the leaves that whispered along the high hedgerows. From the lane leading down to the green, the air was sweet with the mingled scents of late roses and the yeasty promise of fresh bread cooling on kitchen windowsills. It might have been any other serene afternoon in the village, save for the fact that Rose Cottage, long regarded as the prettiest dwelling in Little Bramble, now stood with its front gate swinging open in the breeze, the door ajar, and the faint echo of raised voices carrying from within. Earlier that morning, Mrs. Agnes Lorimer, a robust woman with a fondness for lilac perfume and bracing gossip, had seen the new tenant of Rose Cottage, Miss Clara Dunn, return from the post office clutching a letter that seemed to trouble her. By noon, several villagers had noticed her blinds drawn against the daylight, and by 2 o'clock, Mrs. Lorimer, passing again on her way to the baker's, found the front garden quite deserted, despite the half-eaten tea tray visible through the parlor window. It was not until Mr. George Tapping, the village constable, entered that the rumor solidified into fact. Miss Clara Dunn was dead. Not a natural, peaceful death either. Though the constable was cagey with details, it was whispered that she had been found slumped beside her writing desk, one hand outstretched toward the letter she had received that morning. The letter itself was gone. By late afternoon, word had spread through every parlor and shop in Little Bramble, with each telling acquiring fresh embroidery. Mrs. Maplethorpe swore she had heard a man's voice arguing with Miss Dunn the night before. Mr. Pritchard, who delivered the milk, claimed he'd seen a shadow moving behind the lace curtains at an odd hour. A few suggested that Miss Dunn, being a newcomer, had somehow stirred old grudges. At the far end of the high street, in a small, neat garden overflowing with pink hollyhocks and late-blooming dahlias, Miss Jane Marple paused in her weeding. She had overheard enough from the milkman's distracted chatter to gather the essence of the thing. Her eyes, pale and deceptively mild, regarded the trowel in her hand as though weighing the matter. Miss Marple, after all, knew something of Rose Cottage. She remembered the family who had lived there years ago, before Clara Dunn's tenancy, and certain whispers that had trailed them when they left under less than happy circumstances. Human nature, Miss Marple often said, did not alter greatly with the seasons. Only the flowers in the garden changed. By tea time, she was seated at her round table, a cup before her, listening as Mrs. Lorimer recounted the day's events with dramatic pauses. Most people, Miss Marple reflected, were eager to fill silence with theories, and in their eagerness, they tended to reveal more than they intended. She asked a few gentle questions, nothing that might seem pressing. But in the jumble of speculation, one detail caught her attention, small, seemingly trivial, yet enough to make her set down her cup and look into the fire for a long moment. She said nothing of it, not yet. For she knew the heart of the matter was not in what people claimed had happened, but in the little things they forgot they had said at all. And somewhere in Rose Cottage, the shadow over its name had begun to lengthen. At 6:30, when the long light across the green had thinned to a honeyed ribbon and the rooks were beginning their nightly argument in the elms, Miss Marple put aside her knitting and her mild interest in Mrs. Lorimer's looping narrative. She had asked, quite casually, whether the tea tray had been in the parlor when Mrs. Lorimer passed by the second time or the first. Mrs. Lorimer, who liked to be precise only when it flattered her own memory, had said the first certainly, and the blinds quite down by noon, "Oh, yes, my dear. I noticed because one hates waste of daylight." Miss Marple had nodded, and, having thanked her guest for the news and the plum cake she had not brought, saw her to the gate with the gentlest of goodbyes. Walking alone along the lane, Miss Marple kept to the verge where the grass gave slightly underfoot, and the spear thistles licked at her skirts. She took the turning that would not be called a turning by anyone in a hurry, and came up on Rose Cottage from the side rather than the front, so that her first sight of it was the rose-wreathed gable and the northeast window that everyone forgot, as it looked onto nothing but a tangle of hawthorn. It was quiet. The gate still swung. In the delicate sunshine, the door's brass knocker showed a smudged mark where a hand had been not too clean, or, what Miss Marple thought more probable, very clean but damp. The constable had left the front door on the latch for the county men, and there was that respectful emptiness about the entrance hall that one finds when officialdom is expected at any moment. Miss Marple, who had never in her life gone where she had not some reason to be, found hers in a modest bouquet of dahlias she had carried without exactly deciding to. She peered in, called gently, and then stood still as someone who would take no step that might seem intrusive. A pair of heavy shoes sounded on the kitchen tiles, and Mr. George Tapping, faced with Miss Marple and a polite smile, took off his helmet as if she were the magistrate herself. "Only to leave these," she said, holding up the flowers. "It is such a sad business, Mr. Tapping. I thought, well, one does what one can." He coughed, and because he was a kind man, and because Miss Marple had that manner that unknotted the stiffness of rules, he led her into the small sitting room at the front, where the air was already losing its lived-in warmth and settling into a waiting chill. There was, indeed, the tea tray on the little spindle-legged table, with one cup showing the crescent of lipstick, and the other cup clean but wet inside, as if rinsed and set down thoughtlessly. A plate of seed cake had 2 neat bites taken. The knife for lemon slices lay unused. The lace curtains were pulled together so that the room had the turned-down feeling of a bed prepared for sleep. Miss Marple placed her dahlias on the mantel-shelf and looked, not directly, but in the way that dusts and undusts a room with the eyes. "She was found in the study, Miss Marple." Writing room?" Tapping gestured towards the narrower door. "Doctor says, well, we'll see what the county says." He would not say more. His caution had the solidity of a man who likes things to be in their place. "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. "And such a pity. She had such a neat hand." It was not a non sequitur. On the desk lay a blotter flecked with small, regular ovals of ink, and in the basket a crumpled envelope with its stamp torn away. Miss Marple did not stoop. The desk chair had been drawn back hastily. The rug beneath it showed where it had snagged. On the hearth, the faintest smear of gray, no, not ashes, for there was nothing in the grate, only that light scum that follows moist fingers on dark wood. Someone had stood there carefully and turned something over in his mind or between his hands. "She kept to herself?" she asked. "Quiet," Tapping said. "Respectable. Paid the rent regular with Mr. Lockett and all that. Daughter of a music teacher, if it please. Came from Cardiff, so Mrs. Maplethorpe says. Not much to go on, like." "Cardiff," Miss Marple repeated, as if it were a village in next parish. "I have always thought Welsh postmasters the most obliging." Tapping scratched his jaw. "There's the letter, you see." He caught himself. "That is to say, there isn't. The morning's letter. She took it from the post office, and now, Miss Marple agreed mildly, "we have only its absence to look at." Her pale eyes went to the writing desk again and were as bland as milk. The blotters showed the underside of a pressed leaf, No, not a leaf. A commercial watermark, perhaps, caught by the damp. She made a little sound that, with Miss Marple, might be approval or merely the click of a mind closing on a comfortable thought. A car drew up outside, its engine clearing its throat in a way that suggested London rather than the county. A moment later, Inspector Craddock, tall, hat set just a degree too straight to be entirely country, came in with a nod to tapping and a deferential smile for Miss Marple that carried a hint of resignation, as if he recognized the inevitable shape of her presence. "Miss Marple," he said. "How very good of you. I see you have been, leaving flowers." "Only that," she said, with the same sweetness she might have used to encourage a reluctant child to drink milk. "And Mr. Tapping has been so kind." They did not need much conversation after that. Inspector Craddock, who had learned that resistance in such matters led only to the mortification of being quietly righted later, allowed Miss Marple to sit while he went through his first questions. Had Miss Dunn friends? She had had callers, Mrs. Lorimer said, having reappeared, it seemed, at the threshold with the insistence of a habit. A lady from the neighboring village, a Mr. Bancroft from the estate office, the vicar's wife once, to ask about the harvest fate. Had there been a man's voice? Mrs. Maplethorpe claimed so, but she would claim thunder if she had heard a kettle lid rattle. Had anyone been seen going to the back gate? The milkman, Mr. Pritchard, had come at 7 and been away at 10 minutes past. He prided himself on punctuality like the sun. And the blinds? Miss Marple asked so straightly that it did not feel like a change. "Drawn at noon, you said, Mrs. Lorimer." "At noon precisely." Mrs. Lorimer sniffed. "Waste of daylight." "And at 1 o'clock, Inspector Craddock put in, consulting the constable's notes. "Miss Maplethorpe saw a shadow moving behind the lace curtain." "Which would be rather difficult," Miss Marple said. And somehow it did not sound like contradiction. Lace curtains filter shaded light very prettily, but drawn blinds are not transparent at all. One has to choose, you know. Craddock's eyes softened with interest. "You noticed that, did you?" "It's a small thing." "Yes," said Miss Marple, looking into the empty hearth. "The smallest things are best. They get left behind like crumbs after a good cake." "What was done with the letter, Inspector?" Craddock's mouth flattened. "We do not know that there was a letter, Miss Marple." "Oh, but there was," she said, with all the innocence that is most irritating to policemen. "Otherwise, Mrs. Lorimer would have had nothing to tell me but her errand to the baker's, which would have been sad." He smiled despite himself. "Very well. There was a letter. The postmistress recalls a brown envelope of stiff quality, like those that hold documents, with a typed address." Miss Dunn looked upset, took the lane directly home. "The envelope is not here. There are, however, signs that something was removed from that desk rather quickly." He indicated the blotter, and the way the pen rest had been nudged half an inch, leaving the dust-free shadow of itself. Miss Marple observed the shadow, as one observes a friend across a tea table. "Someone came back," she said, "after the blinds were drawn." "That is my thought," Craddock admitted. "And yet, there is no sign of forced entry. The back door was fast, the front on the latch, because Mr. Tapping had left it so, and the windows, well, the northeast one sticks. I tried it." "Does it?" Miss Marple said. "Sticky windows are a mercy. One cannot pretend to have gone in by them. Dr. Hayworth," Craddock continued, "puts the time of death between 1 and 3. He notes no marks of violence. He is not prepared to rule out natural failure, heart perhaps. But Miss Dunn was not an old lady. "There are other ways to hush a person," Miss Marple said, and looked at the cooling tea. "A sudden fright, if well administered, can do it very neatly. And the letter would have done for the fright if it contained what I imagine." "And what do you imagine, Miss Marple?" Craddock asked, with that mixture of hope and caution that policemen reserve for elderly women who knit. Miss Marple did not answer at once. She had moved to the sitting-room doorway and was looking at the hall table, where a small spill of sand lay beside an empty matchbox. "I imagine," she said at last, "there are few new crimes, Inspector. There are only new circumstances into which old human failings are poured. Have you spoken to Mr. Lockett? He handles the cottages for the owners, I believe." "I have sent for him," Craddock said. "And for Mr. Bancroft. You know him?" "One hears the names of those who handle other people's troubles," Miss Marple replied. "It saves time later." They came in close upon that. Mr. Lockett, the solicitor's clerk with a smooth way of carrying his hat, and Mr. Peter Bancroft, the estate agent from the big house, whose fair hair managed somehow to look insolent. Lockett was all urbanity, eager regret, and maddeningly little of substance. Yes, Miss Dunn had signed a 6-month tenancy. No, there had been no difficulty. She was punctual with the rent, which she paid in cash. The owners, distant cousins of the old Rose Cottage family, had left matters to him entirely. As to any letter, why, he had written to her regarding a minor repair, but that had been last week, and he had her reply. Bancroft, by contrast, had the restless glance of a man too often in and out of other people's houses. He had arranged for a plumber to see to the kitchen tap on Friday, no need for Miss Dunn to be troubled. And he had not, absolutely had not, seen her yesterday or the day before. "Yet you told Mrs. Lorimer 2 days ago," Craddock said evenly, "that you had been to the cottage to measure the back shed for shelving." Bancroft flushed. "I may have said I intended to." "Men," Miss Marple said kindly, "often mend truth with intention." Bancroft looked at her with dislike that could not be shown to a policeman. "Look here," he muttered. "I hardly knew the woman. And if this is some fuss, I want no part of it." "On the contrary," Craddock said, sharp for the first time, "you want very much to be part of it." "Where were you between 1 and 3? "At the office," Bancroft said at once, then hesitated. "Well, out. There were viewings." "And your office girl will tell us," Craddock said pleasantly, "which of those viewings was at 1:30. Bancroft scowled and said nothing more. Lockett, meanwhile, had drifted to the mantel-shelf, admiring the dahlias as if the color soothed him. He glanced in that careless way at a small porcelain box and lifted the lid with a forefinger. Miss Marple saw his gaze flicker. The box held nothing. The faint sand on the hall table had had nothing to do with matches after all. It had been that peculiar, smooth grit, sometimes used to dry ink, and which tidy people kept in small porcelain boxes. Miss Marple had not seen any on the writing desk. When they were gone, Craddock stood very still in the study and spoke without looking at Miss Marple. "You think the letter concerned the house," he said. "I think," Miss Marple said, "the letter concerned the past. Houses that are very pretty sometimes have had hard things done inside them, and people cannot help bringing old sorrows with them, even when they move." "And Miss Dunn brought a sorrow," Craddock said. "Or someone else brought it to her." Miss Marple answered. "She was a newcomer. Newcomers often do not know where to look for danger. They think it looks like a stranger when it looks very often like help." He gave her a quick look. "Bancroft?" "Perhaps. He has the trick of appearing useful. Mr. Locket also has the trick, but of appearing harmless. One must never confuse the two. She moved to the window and parted the lace with 2 fingers, looking out onto the green. There is another small thing, Inspector. The tea, 2 cups, 1 rinsed and not dried. A visitor who leaves his trace but does not wish to. And the blinds, drawn at noon. Someone wished to be unseen. That suggests daylight, not dusk. And the sand, not where it belongs. Craddock nodded. And the post office? Mrs. Fenn will know whether the letter had a Cardiff hand, Miss Marple said. Postmistresses are excellent at knowing hands. I should like to ask her whether anyone else asked about Miss Dunn's post of late. It is a very mild way of prying into people's affairs. One merely says, "Has there been much for Miss So-and-so?" And the curious cannot help pricking up their ears. He smiled. You will do it better than I. I am an old woman, Miss Marple said, as if it were a disguise. People do not mind if an old woman asks foolish questions. They tell her more in the effort to be kind. They left Rose Cottage as twilight flattened the green into one quiet plain, and the lamps began to bloom in windows like the eyes of cats. The village walked more softly that evening. Doors closed earlier. Curtains met more neatly in their middle. Rumor, which had been brassy at tea time, turned to a whisper under the eaves. Miss Marple, going home by the longer way that passed the vicarage, heard the vicar's wife inside dictating a note about the harvest fete, all brisk efficiency. And a boy on a bicycle whistled, then stopped as if ashamed to provide cheer. At the corner by the post office, Mrs. Fenn was pulling down the blind behind the counter. But Miss Marple slipped in with a murmured apology and a question about stamps. Mrs. Fenn, whose instinct for the post was second only to her instinct for conversation, obligingly kept the blind half up and her tongue entirely so. Yes, indeed, Miss Dunn had had a letter this morning. Brown envelope, as the inspector had said. Typed. Cardiff postmark, yesterday's date. The sort of thing solicitors use. Had anyone else asked after Miss Dunn's post? Why, yes. Mr. Locket's clerk, a week ago, to be certain she had received a notice about a repair. And Mr. Bancroft, yesterday afternoon. Oh, but he had only asked, quite casually, whether Miss Dunn had had much from the post lately. Mrs. Fenn had said not particularly. She prided herself on not saying more than was strictly true when there was a policeman in the village. Miss Marple thanked her and turned to go. The little bell over the door jangled, and a young woman with a shawl too fine for her dress came in, flushed and breathless. She started when she saw Miss Marple, then recovered with a smile too ready, and eyes that could not help looking past her at the pigeonholes where letters slept upright in their slots. Evening, the young woman said, and put a postcard on the counter. She had ink on her fingers. Is there anything for Miss Dunn? Her cheeks pinked deeper. I'm calling for a friend. Mrs. Fenn's mouth pursed, as was its habit when confronted with imprecise relationships. Not now, she said. We are closed. But her eyes slid to Miss Marple, who had become very still and very kind at once. Such a pity, Miss Marple murmured. Miss Dunn has had a long day. The young woman's eyes flicked to her face, searching for something that was not there, and then down again. She pushed coins over for her postcard and went out quickly, almost clumsily. Who is she? Miss Marple asked gently, when the bell had stopped trembling. Seamstress at Mrs. Quayle's, Mrs. Fenn said at once. Name of Ivy Glass. Pretty piece in a way. Head full of romance, I dare say. Pretty pieces, Miss Marple said, are often broken at the edges. She said good night and went back into the deepening evening. On the path home, she did not hurry. The mind, she believed, must not be jolted when it is putting the pieces into their places. She thought of the 2 cups, one rinsed, one not, of blinds drawn at noon, of a brown envelope from Cardiff and a desk from which something had been removed in a hurry, of Locket's easy fingers lifting porcelain lids, of Bancroft's urgent wish not to be anywhere at any particular time, of a pretty, breathless girl asking for letters that were not hers. And she thought, not without a little sorrow, of Rose Cottage as it had once been, with laughter in it and quarrels too, and then with quieter voices, and then with none at all when its people had slipped away under a cloud that the village had discreetly allowed to drift. When she reached her gate, Miss Marple paused to pinch the withered blossom heads from her dahlias. She did not see the figure on the other side of the lane until he took a step forward into the lamplight. It was Mr. Pritchard, the milkman, cap in his hands, worried lines digging grooves in his brow. "Beg pardon, miss," he said. "I didn't like to go to the police. It's a small thing." "They are the best," Miss Marple said, almost to herself. "What is it, Mr. Pritchard?" "It's only, this morning I saw the door at Rose Cottage open a crack at 7:10, and a hand put out the milk money. Only the thing is, Miss Dunn always left it in the little dish inside the porch. And this hand, well, I deliver early, you see, but I thought, that's not a lady's hand. Not with that scar. And when I looked up, well, the door shut quick." "Scar?" Miss Marple said very softly. "A little line, like from a burn," Pritchard said, "across the wrist." "Thank you," Miss Marple said, as if he had given her a rare stamp. She stood quite still after he had gone, and looked up at the sky, where one star had the impertinence to be early. Then she went inside, put the kettle on, and took down, from the top shelf where she kept things for Christmas, a little paper of sand for drying ink. She poured a pinch on a saucer and watched how it took the light. Somewhere, behind the facade of a cottage with roses carved upon its name, a piece had just moved. Not far, not noisily, but enough to show its shape. The next morning broke pale and cool, with a thin mist hanging low over the hedgerows and the grass on the green beaded with dew. From her kitchen window, Miss Marple watched the village stir to life with a measured rhythm of habit. Mrs. Lorimer airing her front room, the vicar crossing the lane with a sheaf of notices, young Ned Polkinghorne pedaling off to the station with his satchel. Rose Cottage, however, remained shuttered and still, its roses clinging damply to the trellis like faded ribbons on an abandoned hat. She had planned to go to the post office under the pretext of sending a parcel to her niece in Eastbourne. But Inspector Craddock's arrival forestalled her. His tread was brisk on her path, and he removed his hat with a quick nod. "I thought," he said without sitting, "you might like to hear the latest before the village gets to it. Dr. Hayworth has amended his opinion. It wasn't a heart failure after all. Quiet but effective poisoning. Digitalis, likely in her tea." Miss Marple's pale eyes rested on him, calm as still water. "Digitalis is most effective in tea," she observed. "It has the advantage of bitterness masked by sweetness and a tendency to leave no trace in the smell." Craddock inclined his head. "The tricky part is time. The tea must have been drunk not long before death. We're assuming the visitor who shared that tray was the one who administered it." "The rinsed cup," Miss Marple said quietly. "A guess tidy enough to wash away the evidence, but not thorough enough to dry it. That's my thought. We've accounted for her morning, alone until 11:30, when Mrs. Lorimer passed the first time. The letter from Cardiff arrived at 10. By noon, blinds drawn. Then, a visitor between 12 and 1. and death before 3. Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded in her lap as if in prayer. Has the letter been traced? Not yet. Cardiff postmark, no return address. Could have been sent from any number of places in the city. I've got someone on it. He hesitated. There's something else. That young seamstress, Miss Ivy Glass, you saw last night. We found out she was in the habit of calling on Miss Dunn now and again. Claims she went there on Tuesday to fit a dress she was altering, and that Miss Dunn gave her £1 in advance for more work. But she didn't mention that visit when questioned yesterday. Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. Omissions can be far more telling than lies. Did she say why she came to the post office asking after Miss Dunn's letters? She says curiosity, that she hadn't seen her friend about and wondered if she'd gone away. But she seemed nervous. More nervous when we asked whether she knew either Bancroft or Lockett. She claimed not to. I'm not so sure. Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. The young are often confident in their ability to conceal attachments. But the village is not so obliging as to let such things remain hidden. She rose, and Craddock, after a brief pause, accepted her unspoken suggestion to walk with her. They took the longer way toward the high street, passing fields where the mist still clung to the furrows. Craddock outlined the rest of his morning's work. Bancroft had produced an alibi of sorts, a viewing with a farmer at the north end of the parish, though the man's recollection was vague and did not exclude a short absence. Lockett, on the other hand, had been in his office, with 2 clerks to vouch for him. And Mr. Pritchard's scarred hand? Miss Marple asked gently. Craddock looked startled. Ah, you've been told about that? Mr. Pritchard told me himself. 7:10, he said. That would be long before Miss Dunn drew the blinds. Yes, which means whoever took in the milk money may not have been Miss Dunn at all. And if so, well, that's our first sign she wasn't alone that morning. They came upon the post office, its door propped open to the warming air. Mrs. Fenn was behind the counter, knitting between customers. She greeted them with the enthusiasm of one who relishes the notion that her place of work has become the center of gravity for the entire village. Miss Marple inquired after stamps, and Craddock used the moment to confirm the details of yesterday's conversation. Mrs. Fenn was firm. The letter had been of good quality paper, a typed address, and Miss Dunn had looked distinctly unsettled. She had gone straight home, not stopping to speak to anyone. And the day before yesterday, Miss Marple said lightly, Mr. Bancroft came in? Yes, about mid-afternoon. And Mr. Lockett's young man the week before, yes. Mrs. Fenn's eyes sparkled with the pleasure of perfect recall. Oh, and now I think of it. Miss Dunn sent a registered letter herself last Thursday, to an address in Cardiff, funnily enough. Craddock straightened. You're certain? Mrs. Fenn nodded. I remember because she was very particular about the receipt. Addressed to a Mr. Gareth Llewellyn. I had to spell it twice. Miss Marple made a small humming sound. People who send registered letters often expect something important in return. Outside, Craddock was already making notes. We'll find out who Llewellyn is. Might be our link. Indeed, Miss Marple said, though her mind seemed to be elsewhere. Inspector, have you considered that Miss Dunn's tenancy began only 6 weeks ago? It is a very short time in which to become the target of a crime such as this, unless the seed was planted long before. You think she was followed here? Perhaps not in the literal sense, but her arrival in Little Bramble may have been no accident. People sometimes choose places because of who or what was there before. They parted at the green, Craddock heading for the station to send a wire. Miss Marple turning down a narrower lane that led to Mrs. Quayle's dressmaking establishment. She entered to the tinkling of a bell, greeted by the sight of bolts of fabric stacked neatly along the walls and the faint whir of a sewing machine in the back room. Mrs. Quayle herself, a brisk woman with pincushion bracelets, emerged, spectacles perched on the end of her nose. "Miss Marple, come about the curtains?" "Not today, my dear. I happened to see Miss Ivy Glass yesterday and was reminded how very skilled your girls are. Such fine hands for detail." Mrs. Quayle beamed. "Ivy's a clever one, no doubt. Bit flighty, not always in by the book, but she's got away with alterations." "And she has friends, I suppose?" Miss Marple said idly, fingering a bolt of navy serge. "Oh, here and there. Mostly girls her own age, though she's done work for half the parish. Had that job for Miss Dunn. Black crepe dress, quite elegant. Ivy took it over last Tuesday, I believe. Spent a good hour there, she said. Came back with a sovereign in her pocket and her head in the clouds." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Black crepe? Morning attire, perhaps?" "Could be," Mrs. Quayle said. "Though Miss Dunn didn't seem the grieving type." She lowered her voice. "Between you and me, I think Ivy fancied herself a little in Miss Dunn's company. The lady had a way of making people feel they were part of something special." Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind turning over the image of a young girl in a cottage with drawn blinds, a black dress in her arms, and a pound in her pocket. On her way back, she took the footpath past the vicarage, where the Reverend Jameson was trimming the hedge. He straightened, smiling in that absent way of men whose minds are still on their sermon notes. "Ah, Miss Marple. Terrible business about poor Miss Dunn. My wife said you'd been speaking to Mrs. Lorimer, and to think she was here only the other day. Miss Dunn, I mean. Came about the fete. Wanted to know if the flower show included roses in pots. I told her it did, and she seemed, well, oddly intent on the matter. Said she'd be sure to attend." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Roses in pots? Not cut flowers?" Yes. I thought nothing of it at the time." She walked on slowly, the vicar's words joining the jumble of facts in her mind. A cottage named for its roses, a tenant who asked about potted ones, a registered letter to a man in Cardiff, a black crepe dress, the rinsed cup, and somewhere, a hand with a scar reaching for milk money at 7 in the morning. By the time she reached her gate, a figure was waiting. Mr. Locket, hat in hand, with the air of a man who hopes to look casual, but is far from it. "Miss Marple," he said smoothly, "I thought I'd just, well, see how you were after the shock of yesterday's events. Such things unsettle a village, don't they?" "They do indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "especially when the matter is not yet settled." He smiled faintly. "Of course. I trust the police are being thorough." "They are most diligent. But sometimes thoroughness overlooks the small corners, such as why a young lady from Cardiff would take Rose Cottage on a short tenancy, or why her first week included a registered letter to a Mr. Llewellyn there." Locket's smile froze for just a fraction before returning to its polished state. "I wouldn't know, I'm afraid. My role was purely administrative." Miss Marple inclined her head, as if accepting his explanation. "And yet," she said gently, "I fancy you know the history of Rose Cottage rather better than most. One does not handle a property for years without learning a little of its past occupants." Locket's fingers tightened on his hat brim. "The past has no bearing on this matter, Miss Marple." "Does it not?" she asked, with the mildness of someone who has already placed a piece firmly on the board. When he had gone, She sat down at her table and took up her knitting, though the needles moved without her really seeing them. The pattern was becoming clear, but one stitch, a crucial stitch, was still missing. She suspected she would find it not in Cardiff, nor in any solicitor's letter, but here, in Little Bramble, in the quiet corners where human nature liked to think itself unnoticed. And she knew, with the certainty of one who had seen too many small tragedies unfold, that before long someone in the village would make the mistake of assuming she had not noticed them at all. By the following afternoon, the late September sun had thinned into a watery gold that cast long shadows across the green. There was a faint smell of wood smoke from the cottages at the far end, and the steady sound of shears trimming hedges drifted over the low garden walls. Little Bramble had returned, outwardly at least, to its quiet rhythm, though the rhythm now carried an undertone, like the faint hum of a wasp trapped in a jam jar. Everyone moved with the brisk politeness of people who were careful not to say too much in public, while saying a great deal behind closed doors. Miss Marple, however, preferred to do her talking and listening out in the open, where the scenery put people at ease. That afternoon she was seated on the wooden bench near the duck pond, ostensibly feeding a small flotilla of ducks with stale crusts. She wore her second-best hat and the faint smile of someone whose mind is entirely on the ducks, though her ears missed very little of the conversation drifting across the water. From behind her came the unmistakable nasal tones of Mrs. Maplethorpe, speaking to her sister-in-law in the kind of stage whisper that is calculated to be overheard. "Mark my words, Gladys. It'll be that Bancroft fellow. Too much of the quick tongue and the quick step, if you ask me. Always here, there, and everywhere. And that motor car of his, goodness knows where he goes in it." Gladys sniffed. "I wouldn't be surprised. But then again, what about that girl at Mrs. Quayle's? Ivy something? Always with her head full of fancies. My Bert says he saw her crying behind the post office last week. And young girls don't cry like that unless there's a man or money involved, sometimes both." Miss Marple, who never let good gossip go to waste, filed this away without turning her head. She scattered the last of the crumbs, rose with an air of mild satisfaction, and took the long path that wound behind the old mill towards Rose Cottage. The cottage itself looked much the same as before. Roses still heavy with bloom, gate still on its crooked hinge, windows shuttered. But there was movement at the side. Inspector Craddock stepping out from the back door, a small ledger in his hand. "Ah, Miss Marple," he called, "just the person. We've been going through Miss Dunn's belongings. Thought you might like to know what's turned up." He handed her the ledger. It was bound in cheap brown cloth, the sort stationers sell by the dozen, but the handwriting inside was precise and neat. The pages were headed with dates, and beneath each, a list of items, with corresponding amounts: rent, groceries, coal, and, curiously, 3 entries marked flowers, roses in pots, each paid for in cash. "Not a large sum," Craddock said, "but odd for someone with no garden interest beyond the name over her door." Miss Marple turned a page. 3 purchases, 1 each week since she arrived, and all from the same nursery, I presume. "Yes. Hargreaves, over in Barrow End. I checked. Roses in pots are easily moved," Miss Marple murmured. "One can carry them inside, or out again." Craddock gave her a sharp look. "You think she hid something among them?" "It's possible. Pots are remarkably good at holding secrets. Letters, small boxes, anything one might not wish others to see. And being alive, they don't invite the same kind of handling as, say, a drawer." He tapped the cover of the ledger thoughtfully. We didn't find any roses inside the cottage, though. Only the ones outside, and they're ordinary enough. Ordinary to the unpracticed eye, perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly. I should like to see them all the same. They walked together round to the front. The pots were set in a neat row beside the path, cheerful pinks and yellows, their soil dark and slightly damp from the morning's watering. Miss Marple bent over them, peering without touching. Her gaze rested on the third pot from the left, where the soil was uneven, as though it had been disturbed and pressed down again in haste. This one, she said quietly. Craddock crouched, prodded the soil with a finger, then reached in carefully. His hand closed on something hard, a small tin, the sort that once held pastilles. He prized it open. Inside was a tightly folded sheet of paper, its creases worn but the type still clear. It was a letter, dated a week before Miss Dunn's death, addressed to her at Rose Cottage. The message was brief. The matter is not closed. You know what is owed. You have until the end of the month. No signature. Craddock exhaled slowly. Blackmail. Or a debt of another kind, Miss Marple said. People are rarely so precise unless they expect the other party to understand without question. And Miss Dunn clearly understood. She hid the letter rather than destroy it. They replaced the tin for the time being, covering their movements from the lane. Craddock suggested they speak to Ivy Glass next, and Miss Marple agreed, though for her own reasons. They found the girl in Mrs. Quayle's back room, bent over a length of pale blue silk. She straightened at their approach, color rushing to her cheeks. Miss Glass, Craddock said, we need to ask you again about your visits to Rose Cottage, and about the black crepe dress you altered for Miss Dunn. Ivy glanced from him to Miss Marple, who stood quietly by the door. I told you, I took it over Tuesday. She said it was for a cousin's funeral. I don't know anything else. Did she seem upset? The girl bit her lip. A bit. Not crying, but tight, like she was holding something in. And on the day she died? Craddock pressed. I didn't see her. I only went to the post office because, well, I thought she might be away, and I wanted to know when she'd be back. She said she'd take me to Cardiff one day, show me the shops. Miss Marple spoke for the first time. And did she ever mention a Mr. Llewellyn? Ivy's eyes flickered. Number should she have? It is not for me to say, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. But if there is something you've left out, perhaps something you think unimportant, it would be wise to remember that unimportant things have a way of becoming very important indeed. Ivy looked down at the silk, twisting the edge between her fingers. There was a man. I don't know his name. He came to the cottage once when I was there. Tall, fair hair. He talked to her in the study. She didn't introduce us, but when he left, he gave me this look, like he knew me. It made me uncomfortable. Bancroft, Craddock said grimly. When they stepped out into the lane again, Miss Marple paused to take in the mild afternoon air. Inspector, she said, you must ask yourself why Miss Dunn, a newcomer with no visible ties, should receive threatening letters from Cardiff, hide them in potted roses, and yet still entertain visitors who clearly made her uneasy. You think the two men are working together? Not necessarily. Sometimes the most dangerous complications come when two people are pursuing the same thing without realizing the other is too. They had reached the corner by the green when Mrs. Lorimer hailed them from her gate. Inspector, Miss Marple, you'll never guess. I saw that Bancroft fellow this morning carrying a crate into his office. Heavy, it looked, and he was very careful with it. Said it was samples, but it rattled. Miss Marple's eyes softened. though her mind was already moving ahead. "Samples do rattle, Mrs. Lorimer," she said kindly. "So do boxes of things one prefers not to name." When they parted, she walked slowly home, knitting together the fragments. Bancroft's careful crate, Ivy's nervousness, the black dress, the potted roses, the scarred hand. Somewhere in the weave there was a pattern she recognized, one she had seen before, in a different village, under a different name. And if she was right, the next move would not come from the police, but from the person who believed the matter nearly over. Which meant, of course, that she had to make sure it was not. That evening brought with it one of those soft, windless twilights where the air seemed to hang between day and night, and the village lamps blinked on reluctantly, as though not quite ready to admit that darkness had come. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting, watched the lamplighter's progress along the green. She was not expecting visitors, yet when a quick light rap came at her door, she was unsurprised. It was Ivy Glass, looking pale and uncertain, the strap of her handbag wound tightly around one hand. "May I come in?" the girl asked. "Of course, my dear. The kettle has only just boiled." In the warm familiarity of Miss Marple's sitting room, Ivy seemed to relax a little, though her eyes darted to the curtained windows as if afraid of being seen. "I thought you might be kind," she began, her voice low. "I can't tell the inspector. I don't want trouble. But there's something you should know." Miss Marple set out 2 cups, her manner as unhurried as if they were discussing embroidery patterns. It is often a good idea to unburden oneself before trouble grows too large to carry. Ivy clasped her hands. "It's about that man, Bancroft. The day I was at Rose Cottage with the black dress, he came. Miss Dunn seemed almost afraid of him. After he left, she asked me if I had any family in Cardiff. I said no, and she looked relieved. She told me not to mention his visit to anyone." "And you did not," Miss Marple said gently. But 2 days later, I saw him near Mrs. Quayle's shop. He stopped me, asked how my sewing was going. Then he said something strange. 'If anyone asks, you've not been near the cottage this week.' I hadn't, but..." Ivy hesitated. "Yesterday, after Miss Dunn died, I found something in my work bag. I didn't put it there." She reached into her handbag and produced a small envelope, unsealed, containing a folded scrap of newspaper. On it was pasted a few lines cut from some printed circular. "Keep your mouth shut and you'll be safe. Speak and you'll regret it." Miss Marple's fingers lingered on the paper, feeling its cheap pulp and faint smell of damp. "When did you find this?" "Yesterday morning, before the police came to Mrs. Quayle's. I didn't know what to do. I tore it up, but then I thought, maybe you'd know." Miss Marple's eyes were kind, but her voice was firm. "You were quite right to come to me. This sort of thing is not meant to frighten you for nothing. It is meant to keep you from noticing something you have already seen." Ivy swallowed. "Do you think Bancroft killed her?" "My dear, it is unwise to think too much in terms of a single person. The truth has a habit of involving more than one hand, if not more than one mind." When Ivy had gone, Miss Marple sat for some minutes in thought. The note's crude anonymity was a contrast to the typed precision of the Cardiff letter. Different styles, different purposes, but perhaps converging on the same point. The next morning she went to see Inspector Craddock, who was in his temporary office at the Vicarage Hall, papers spread before him like a card player deciding his next move. "I should like to speak to Mr. Bancroft," Miss Marple said without preamble. Craddock frowned. "You think you can get something from him that I can't?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that men like Mr. Bancroft tend to underestimate elderly ladies in hats." Craddock sighed, but arranged it. They found Bancroft in his estate office, a neat little building at the edge of the high street, its windows bright with potted geraniums. He rose when they entered, his fair hair catching the light, but there was no warmth in his greeting. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" he asked. Miss Marple smiled, as if it truly were one. "I was hoping you might help me with a small matter. I understand you've been to Rose Cottage several times in recent weeks. You must know something of Miss Dunn." "I told the inspector everything I know," Bancroft said shortly. "I was there on business, nothing more." "Of course," Miss Marple said sweetly. "But business can be so varied, sometimes involving property, sometimes involving people. I believe you saw Miss Dunn on Tuesday?" Bancroft's eyes narrowed. "Who says so?" "Why, the person who was also there," Miss Marple replied mildly. "She recalled you looking at her as though you knew her, and you do know her, Miss Ivy Glass, who works for Mrs. Quayle." He shrugged, feigning indifference. "I've seen her about. That's hardly unusual." "Indeed not," Miss Marple agreed. "What is unusual is to tell someone not to go near a certain house, or to make it appear they had not been there, unless one had a reason to conceal one's own presence." Bancroft gave a short laugh. "You've been listening to gossip. Dangerous habit." "Not nearly as dangerous as receiving letters from Cardiff," Miss Marple said, watching the quick flicker in his expression. "Or as hiding them in rose pots." For a second he said nothing, then his lips curled into a smile that did not touch his eyes. "You're very sharp, Miss Marple. But you don't know everything. That woman, Miss Dunn, she was playing a game she couldn't win. She had something that belonged to someone else. I was just trying to get it back before things got messy." "And did you?" His gaze was cool. "If I had, we wouldn't be here talking." Craddock leaned forward. "Who did it belong to, Bancroft?" But Bancroft only spread his hands. "Not my story to tell." They left with little more than they had entered with, save for Miss Marple's conviction that Bancroft was holding back not to protect himself, but because there was someone else involved. Someone whose shadow fell over him as clearly as it had over Rose Cottage. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk to the far end of the village, where the path dipped toward the mill stream. Here stood a low brick building with a sagging roof, used for storage by various tradesmen. Its door was ajar, and from within came the sound of movement, boxes being shifted, something metallic clinking. She stepped lightly to the side and glanced in. Bancroft was there, alone, lifting the lid from a wooden crate. The same crate Mrs. Lorimer had seen him carry. Inside, Miss Marple glimpsed stacks of small tins, much like the pastille tin that had held the Cardiff letter. She withdrew as quietly as she had approached, her mind tightening around the new piece. Tins, letters, potted roses. Containers, all of them, for things that should not be easily found. By the time she reached home, dusk was falling, and she knew what she had to do. She took out her writing paper, addressed a short note to Inspector Craddock, and asked him to meet her at Rose Cottage the next morning. There, she said, they would find the last piece of proof they needed, if they were quick enough. She sealed the envelope, placed it by the door for the early post, and went to draw her curtains. Across the lane, a figure paused under the lamplight, watching her house for a moment before moving on. It was too far to make out the face, but the silhouette was slim, the gait deliberate. Miss Marple stood for a while at the window, her knitting untouched, listening to the quiet. Somewhere in the village, someone believed the matter was nearly done, the loose ends tied. She smiled faintly. They were about to learn that the smallest thread, left dangling, could unravel the whole. The next morning was sharp and bright, the air scented with chimney smoke and the last tang of dew. Miss Marple arrived at Rose Cottage promptly at 9, her step measured, her eyes taking in the unaltered stillness of the place. Inspector Craddock was already there, speaking in low tones to Constable tapping by the gate. He looked up as she approached, and she thought he had the slightly wary air of a man who had been promised something but was not entirely certain of what it might be. "You said there was proof?" Craddock began as they stepped into the narrow hall. "Something decisive. I'd like to know what I'm meant to be looking for." Miss Marple removed her gloves with unhurried precision. "Not something, Inspector. Somewhere. The thing itself may already be gone, but the place where it was kept will tell us more than you imagine." She led the way into the sitting room. The tea tray still sat on the spindle-legged table exactly as they had left it, its cups and saucers neatly arranged for the county photographer's inspection. She ignored it entirely, heading instead for the corner by the window, where a plain oak chest sat against the wall. "I remarked before," she said, "that Rose Cottage has a northeast window people tend to forget. In this corner, the light falls differently. One notices if something is moved." She knelt, quite without effort to Craddock's mild astonishment, and ran her fingers along the base of the chest. There, under a thin film of dust, was a small notch. With a deft movement, she pressed it, and the baseboard sprang up a fraction of an inch. "A carpenter's compartment," she said. "Old cottages have them. They make excellent hiding places for papers, though not for anything larger." Craddock crouched beside her, lifting the false board. The space beneath was empty save for a scattering of fine grit, the color of dried ink sand and a faint, sharp scent. He held a pinch to his nose. "Tobacco?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Number powdered digitalis leaves a smell like that when crushed. Someone kept a packet here, most likely the same someone who poured it into Miss Dunn's tea." "Which means," Craddock said slowly, "the killer knew this compartment was here." "Just so. And that knowledge would not be common, unless one had either owned the place, worked on it, or been told directly. Miss Dunn was here only a short time. She could not have discovered it by accident. Whoever showed her or accessed it themselves is our person of interest." Craddock's gaze hardened. "Bancroft again?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said mildly. "But let us not forget Mr. Lockett, who has handled this property for years and would know its every quirk. And there is also the question of how our scarred-handed visitor at 7 in the morning fits in. Bancroft's hands are smooth. Mr. Lockett's as well." Craddock frowned. "Which leaves?" "The trades," Miss Marple said. "The plumber Bancroft mentioned, perhaps. Or someone else with reason to be about early and unnoticed." They replaced the board and dust, leaving the compartment as they had found it. Miss Marple suggested they walk the lane to Bancroft's office. Craddock agreed, though his manner suggested he doubted the utility of further talk. They had not gone far when Mrs. Maplethorpe intercepted them, breathless and clearly vibrating with fresh news. "Inspector, Miss Marple, you've heard, of course. Mr. Bancroft's gone off in his motor car. 7:45 this morning, heading toward Barrow End. Said it was business, but he looked as nervous as a cat in a dog yard." "Barrow End," Craddock murmured. "The nursery where Miss Dunn bought her roses." Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet satisfaction. "Then perhaps he is going to check on a certain pot, or remove it entirely. Craddock signaled to Tapping, who was loitering nearby. "Get the car. We're going to Barrow End." The nursery lay on the edge of the next village, a sprawl of greenhouses and outdoor beds, the air warm with the scent of damp earth and green leaves. They arrived to find Bancroft's motor standing by the gate. Inside, he was speaking in low tones to the proprietor, Mr. Hargreaves, who looked up with a mixture of relief and unease when he saw the inspector. "Ah, good morning," Hargreaves said. "Mr. Bancroft was just asking after a special order we filled a few weeks ago. Roses in pots delivered to Rose Cottage." "And?" Craddock prompted. "They were all standard varieties, save one," Hargreaves said reluctantly. "Miss Dunn asked for a pot with a deep base, said she wanted to keep it indoors for a while. I thought nothing of it, but it's an unusual request. We drilled the drainage hole higher up so it would hold more soil at the bottom." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "More soil, or something else?" Bancroft's composure cracked. "You've no proof of anything," he snapped. "I was just tying up loose ends for the estate. If Miss Dunn had hidden something here, it's my duty to recover it for the owners." "Your duty," Miss Marple said, "or your interest? Because if what was hidden there was a letter from Cardiff addressed to a certain Mr. Gareth Llewellyn, then your concern might be of a very personal nature." Bancroft's jaw tightened. "I've nothing to say." They left him there, pacing beside his car. Craddock was grim. "If we find that pot, it could give us the leverage we need, but I'll wager whatever was in it is already gone." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But pots, like hiding places, leave their own sort of witness marks. Soil is disturbed, roots are cut. It will be clear if something was removed in haste." On their way back, they stopped at Mrs. Quayle's under the pretext of inquiring after a curtain repair. Miss Marple, with casual chatter, asked after Ivy. Mrs. Quayle said the girl was not in. She'd gone out early, not saying where. "She's been in a state these last few days," Mrs. Quayle confided. "Jumping at the bell, looking out the window. I told her to get some fresh air." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Yes, sometimes fresh air is just what's needed before a difficult decision." Outside, Craddock gave her a sideways glance. "You think Ivy's mixed up in this more than she's admitted?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that Miss Dunn, Mr. Bancroft, and perhaps Mr. Lockett all knew about something. Something tied to Cardiff and to the history of Rose Cottage. Ivy may have stumbled across it without understanding its value. And someone wants her silent." By the time they reached Little Bramble, the afternoon was edging toward evening. A light mist had begun to gather, turning the green into a soft blur. Miss Marple paused at the gate of Rose Cottage, looking at the shuttered windows. "In villages," she said quietly, "the past never stays buried. It sits just beneath the surface, waiting for the right spade to uncover it, or the wrong one." Craddock studied her face. "You have an idea what this is about, don't you?" She gave him her mildest smile. "An idea, yes. But an idea is not proof. Proof is in the reactions people give when you put the right temptation or the right fear before them. You're planning something." "I am, Inspector. I am going to invite certain people to tea, and I shall serve it very carefully indeed." She walked away, her step unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. But Craddock, watching her, had the uneasy sense that time in this matter might be shorter than either of them liked, and that Miss Marple intended to use every remaining moment to its sharpest edge. 2 days later, Miss Marple's small parlor was arranged with the same neat precision she brought to her knitting bag. A fire burned low in the grate, casting a steady warmth over the polished table where a fresh cloth had been laid, and her best china stood ready in a perfect half-circle. The tea tray, with its silver pot and 2 matching cups, gleamed as if it had been polished for an inspection. On a side table, a second, less conspicuous tray was prepared. Identical cups, identical plates, but a pot that was not quite as full. Inspector Craddock arrived first, his expression caught between suspicion and amusement. "You really mean to do this?" he murmured, glancing at the arrangements. "I do," Miss Marple replied serenely. "There are certain truths that will not come out in a formal interview, but they have a way of slipping when people are in a parlor, faced with polite company and a teacup in hand. And if they don't slip, then we shall have learned who can control themselves, and perhaps more tellingly, who cannot bear to." Her guests arrived within minutes of one another. Mr. Locket came first, the very picture of courtesy, hat in hand, followed closely by Bancroft, whose fair hair was combed so precisely it seemed a challenge to the air to disturb it. Last was Ivy Glass, shoulders drawn in as though to make herself smaller, eyes darting from Bancroft to Locket and back again. Miss Marple greeted each with equal warmth, seating them so that the tea table formed a triangle of view between them. "I'm so glad you could all come," she began, pouring the first cup for Locket. "I thought it only right, in such a sad time, that we remember Miss Dunn together, whatever our acquaintance with her." "That's very kind, Miss Marple," Locket said smoothly. "It has been a difficult week for the village." Bancroft muttered something that might have been agreement, though his eyes were fixed on the fire. Ivy only nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking a great deal about her roses," Miss Marple continued, passing the second cup to Ivy. "Such a charming choice. Potted roses in a small garden. Not everyone would think to keep them indoors." Locket smiled faintly. "Practical, in a way. One can move them about, keep them safe from frost." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "or hide something in the soil." There was a small silence. Ivy's cup trembled slightly in her hand. Bancroft looked up sharply. "Hide," he said with a laugh that rang too high. "You've been listening to gossip, Miss Marple. People will say anything these days." "I do listen," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "It's surprising what one hears. For instance, that Miss Dunn received a letter from Cardiff the morning she died, and that she had sent one to a Mr. Gareth, Llewellyn there the week before." Bancroft's fingers tightened around his cup. Locket's expression did not change, but the faintest flush rose in his cheeks. "Letters between Cardiff and Little Bramble are hardly a crime," Locket said smoothly. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But blackmail is, and so is murder to keep a debt of money or of conscience from being called in." She poured from the second pot now, the one on the side table, handing the fresh cup to Bancroft. He took it without looking at her, his gaze on Ivy, who was staring down into her own tea. "Miss Dunn hid one letter in a rose pot," Miss Marple went on, her tone light, conversational. "And another item, a packet of digitalis powder, in a carpenter's compartment in the sitting room. That second hiding place could only have been known to someone familiar with the house before she came. A very limited group indeed." "Are you accusing me?" Locket demanded, his composure cracking for the first time. "I am making an observation," Miss Marple said. "You, Mr. Locket, have known Rose Cottage for years. Mr. Bancroft, you have been in and out on various errands. And Ivy, She turned to the girl, whose knuckles were white around her cup. "You saw something on the day of Miss Dunn's death that you have not yet told us." Ivy's breath caught. She looked from Lockett to Bancroft, then back at Miss Marple. "I saw his hand." She gestured toward Lockett, who blinked. "I came early, before I was supposed to, and the door was open a crack. A hand put out the milk money. It had a scar across the wrist. Just like—" Her voice faltered. Lockett's hand twitched involuntarily, and in that moment Bancroft's eyes narrowed, not in surprise, but in something that looked dangerously like understanding. "That's ridiculous," Lockett said sharply. "I have no such scar." But Craddock, who had been standing quietly by the mantel, stepped forward. "Actually, Mr. Lockett, I believe you do." Lockett's face went a dull red. "A burn, years ago. Nothing to do with any of this." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Perhaps. And yet it places you at Rose Cottage early that morning, before the blinds were drawn and long before Miss Dunn's death. If you were only delivering milk money, why not leave it in the dish inside the porch as she preferred?" Lockett set his cup down hard. "Because I had something to return to her. A document. She'd left it with me about her tenancy. I didn't want to be late for work, so I slipped it in with the milk money." "And was that document still there when she was found?" Miss Marple asked softly. Lockett did not answer. The silence stretched. Bancroft leaned back, watching him with an expression that now held more calculation than hostility. "I suppose," he said slowly, "that you told me you had nothing to do with her letter from Cardiff because you already had it. That's enough," Lockett snapped. But Miss Marple's voice, still gentle, cut through the tension. "You see, Mr. Lockett, I rather think Miss Dunn knew something about the history of Rose Cottage, something that connected to Mr. Llewellyn in Cardiff. She meant to use it, perhaps to settle an old grievance. But she underestimated how much someone else feared that knowledge. Digitalis is so very easy to obtain, after all, if one has the right connections." Lockett's gaze shifted from her to Bancroft and back again. "You can't prove anything." "Perhaps not yet," Miss Marple said. "But the truth has a way of showing itself, especially when those involved begin to quarrel." Craddock moved toward Lockett, but Miss Marple lifted a hand. "No, Inspector, not here. Let him go. Sometimes a little rope is exactly what's needed to find the right knot." Lockett stood abruptly, muttered something about business, and left without finishing his tea. Bancroft followed more slowly, his expression thoughtful. Ivy lingered, pale and shaken. "I didn't mean to say it," she whispered. "But I couldn't when you looked at me like that." "You did exactly what you should," Miss Marple said. "And now we know who was at the cottage that morning. That is a very important piece, my dear." When Ivy had gone, Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "You've stirred the pot all right. But if you're wrong, I am not wrong," Miss Marple said calmly, collecting the cups. "Now we wait. If Mr. Lockett fears exposure, he will act, and that will tell us whether he is merely an opportunist or a murderer." She stacked the china neatly, her hands steady, her eyes far away. Somewhere in the village, she knew, the next move was already being planned, and it would either confirm her suspicion or force her to look again at the whole pattern. Either way, the game was moving toward its end. The next 24 hours in Little Bramble passed under a peculiar hush, the kind that makes people walk quicker to their doors at dusk and speak in lowered voices when passing in the lane. Miss Marple, going about her ordinary errands, noticed that Mr. Lockett's office blinds were drawn even in the morning, and that Bancroft's motor car made 2 unexplained trips toward the Barrow End Road. Ivy Glass, for her part, did not appear at Mrs. Quayle's shop at all, and Mrs. Quayle herself was telling customers she had sent the girl for a rest. By late afternoon, a thin rain had begun to fall, silvering the cobbles of the high street. Miss Marple, umbrella in hand, made her way to the post office, ostensibly to send a small parcel to her niece. Mrs. Fenn, always ready for conversation, was quick to mention that a telegram had arrived that morning for Mr. Locket. "From Cardiff, mind you," Mrs. Fenn said with relish. "Marked urgent. He came for it himself, looking all manner of flustered." Miss Marple smiled faintly. How interesting. Did he say anything? Only that he had business to attend to. Went off in quite a hurry. That hurry, Miss Marple suspected, would not be to the benefit of his peace of mind. A telegram from Cardiff could only mean fresh developments, either from Mr. Llewellyn or from whoever was trying to settle the matter Miss Dunn had left behind. She returned home by the long way, detouring past Rose Cottage. The gate was still crooked, the roses bedraggled from the rain. But she noticed, with the practiced eye of a gardener, that one of the potted roses had been moved. The soil spattered on the path told her it had been shifted only recently, perhaps within the last few hours. That evening, Inspector Craddock arrived at her door without ceremony, raincoat dripping on her mat. "Locket's gone," he said grimly. "Left the office this afternoon. Told his clerk he had an appointment in Barrow End. Never came back." Miss Marple set her teacup down. "And Bancroft?" "Still in the village. But my feeling is he's waiting either for Locket to return or for word that the problem's been resolved." Miss Marple's eyes went to the window, where the lamplight caught the rain streaking down the glass. "I think we had better not wait for either. Rose Cottage has had enough secrets kept within its walls, and I have a very strong notion that tonight someone will try to remove the last of them." By 9 o'clock, then, the rain had lessened to a mist, and the green lay silent under its veil. Craddock had stationed Constable Tapping behind the hawthorn at the lane's bend, while he himself took position by the back of Rose Cottage. Miss Marple, wrapped in her waterproof, approached the front gate as though she were merely checking on the dahlias she had once left for the late Miss Dunn. She did not have long to wait. A figure emerged from the shadows by the side wall, slim, brisk in movement, the brim of a hat pulled low. The figure slipped through the gate without a sound and went straight to the row of potted roses. Crouching, they began to lift one pot after another, checking the undersides, probing the soil. Miss Marple stepped forward. "You will find it more quickly," she said, "if you look in the one nearest the gate. But of course you already knew that." The figure started violently and turned. Mr. Locket, rain beating on his coat, his eyes narrowed. "You've been watching me." "Only this evening," Miss Marple said gently. "But you've been watched by others for longer. Bancroft, for instance. I think he rather expected you to fetch whatever you've hidden here, so he could take it from you. That is the trouble with conspiracies. They are so rarely harmonious." Locket straightened, his hand still on the rim of the pot. "You think you know everything, but you don't know why." "I can guess," Miss Marple said. "Miss Dunn discovered something linking Rose Cottage to Mr. Llewellyn in Cardiff. Perhaps old property dealings, perhaps an affair best forgotten, perhaps even a crime never brought to light. She thought to use it to her advantage. You feared exposure, and so did Bancroft, though for different reasons. Between you, you contrived to keep her quiet. But only one of you knew where the packet of digitalis was kept." Locket's gaze flicked toward the window. "She wasn't supposed to die. She was supposed to be frightened. Enough to leave, enough to hand over the papers. And yet, Miss Marple said, fear is an unpredictable weapon. It can kill more easily than hate if administered at the wrong moment. Behind them, there was a crunch of footsteps. Craddock, stepping from the mist, his revolver drawn. "I'll take that pot, Mr. Lockett." Lockett hesitated, then lifted it slowly. Beneath the surface of the soil, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick envelope. Craddock unwrapped it with care. Inside were several folded documents, and between them, a single sheet of paper, the same coarse brown as the Cardiff letter, bearing a typed demand for payment and a threat of exposure. "So this is what all the trouble's been about," Craddock said. Lockett's face had hardened into something flat and closed. "You'll never prove who put the digitalis in her tea." Miss Marple looked at him for a long moment. "Perhaps not in a court. But you see, I already know. It was not you, Mr. Lockett. You were too cautious. It was Bancroft. He was the one she truly feared. You meant to frighten her. He meant to finish her. The trouble is, when two people are meddling in the same crime, they trip over each other's feet." Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing, only motioned to Tapping, who stepped forward to escort Lockett away. The next morning, Craddock came to Miss Marple's garden, where she was trimming her dahlias, the air still damp from the night's mist. "You were right about Bancroft," he said. "We brought him in at dawn. He broke quickly, claimed Miss Dunn had been threatening to expose an old land swindle he and Llewellyn were part of. She got the documents from a former clerk in Cardiff. He went to the cottage the day she died, saw the letter from Cardiff on her desk, and decided it was safer to silence her. Slipped the digitalis into her tea while she was in the kitchen fetching the cake. Lockett's early visit that morning gave him the perfect excuse to make it look like someone else had been there." Miss Marple laid down her shears. "As I thought. The digitalis is not the tool of a hot temper, it is the weapon of calculation. Bancroft could never resist the neat solution." "And the girl, Ivy?" Craddock asked. She saw more than she realized. The look he gave her was not recognition. It was measuring how much she might have overheard. He warned her off, but when she did not retreat far enough, she became a liability. That is why the note was left in her work bag. But she is safe now. Craddock shook his head with a rueful smile. "You make it sound so tidy, Miss Marple. But if you hadn't prodded them both into showing their hands, we might still be chasing shadows." Miss Marple looked over her dahlias, the blooms nodding gently in the breeze. "Human nature, Inspector. The motives change very little. Only the arrangements alter. And in a small place like Little Bramble, the arrangements are always more visible than the players believe." By the following week, the village had settled into its familiar rhythm. Rose Cottage stood quiet once more, the crooked gate mended, the roses pruned back for winter. Yet the air about it still seemed to carry a faint echo of the shadow that had fallen there. A Fauvabaust, a reminder, perhaps, that even the most charming of houses could hold the darkest of secrets. Miss Marple, for her part, went on with her knitting and her gardening, listening as she always did, ready for the next small thread of human folly to catch her attention. For she knew, better than anyone, that in Little Bramble, the past was never truly past. It was merely waiting for the right eyes to see it. October crept into Little Bramble with the slow grace of a cat settling into a warm chair. Mornings were misty now, the air scented with turned earth and the tang of wood smoke. The events at Rose Cottage were spoken of less in open gossip, though the villagers still glanced toward it when passing, as if half expecting some new chapter to begin. Bancroft had been removed under discreet escort to the county jail. Lockett was facing charges of conspiracy. and Ivy Glass had returned to Mrs. Quayle's shop with the air of one who has narrowly escaped being pulled under in deep water. Miss Marple, as ever, let the rhythms of the village resume around her. Yet she knew well that a case, like a skein of wool, must be wound up properly lest it tangle again later. And there were still small tangles in this one, threads not tied, but left adrift. Inspector Craddock, arriving at her cottage one clear morning, seemed to have the same thought. He brought with him a folder of papers and a weariness that suggested the matter had been tidy in court, but not in his mind. "Bancroft's confession is straightforward enough," he said, settling into the chair by the fire. "The land swindle with Llewellyn in Cardiff, selling parcels that were never fit for building, falsifying deeds, the works. Miss Dunn, being a distant cousin to one of the defrauded, got hold of the documents through that clerk you mentioned. She came here for quiet, but she meant to bring the whole thing into the light. Lockett knew about the old carpenter's compartment and used it to hide the letters from Cardiff. Bancroft found his chance on the day she died." Miss Marple nodded, pouring tea. "And poor Miss Dunn thought she could keep the two men at bay by holding the papers. But once one knows a threat exists, the easiest solution is often to remove it entirely." Craddock sipped his tea, then frowned. "There's something that bothers me. Bancroft says he only went to frighten her. Well, at first, that he made the tea in her kitchen while she fetched the cake. But Digitalis doesn't keep lying about in everyone's pantry. He claims he found the packet already in her cupboard." "That," Miss Marple said softly, "is the part you must be careful with. If it were there already, it means someone else in the house had reason to have it. Miss Dunn herself? Unlikely. She was in good health. Ivy Glass? Possible, if she were foolish enough to be persuaded. Or—" She let the word hang like smoke. Craddock leaned forward. "You mean Lockett left it there?" "It would suit his cautious nature," Miss Marple replied. "A method prepared in advance, in case talk grew too bold. Digitalis, in the right hands, is an excellent deterrent without the untidiness of open threat. But once Bancroft found it, the plan changed. And that, I think, is why Lockett stayed silent after her death. Silence was his safest refuge." They were interrupted by a tap at the door. Ivy Glass stood there, a little out of breath from the brisk walk, her hands gloved, though the day was mild. "I'm sorry to trouble you," she said, glancing between them. "But I thought you ought to know. Someone's been in Rose Cottage again." Craddock straightened. "When?" "This morning. Mrs. Maplethorpe says she saw the side gate open, and the northeast window—" Ivy paused, lowering her voice. "The one that sticks was open a crack. There were footprints in the damp soil by the roses. I went by on my way here, and one of the pots had been tipped over." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And nothing taken?" "I don't know," Ivy said. "But the pot was the one nearest the gate. The same one Mr. Lockett dug in the night you caught him." Craddock was already on his feet. "If there's anything left in that garden someone wants, we'd better find it before they try again." Rose Cottage was quiet when they arrived, its gate sagging in familiar greeting. The tipped pot lay on its side, the soil damp and dark against the path. Craddock crouched to sift through it, his fingers closing on something small and metallic. It was a locket, gold, tarnished at the edges, on a fine chain. Inside was a miniature photograph of a young woman with dark eyes and an unsmiling mouth. On the opposite side, a curl of dark hair was pressed beneath glass. "I don't recognize her," Craddock said, showing it to Miss Marple. But Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "I believe you will, once you ask in Cardiff. That, Inspector, is a mourning locket. Very old, perhaps 40 years. Such keepsakes often belong to those who had cause to keep grief close. And I think Miss Dunn found it when she first took Rose Cottage. It may even have been her reason for coming. Another thread, Craddock said grimly. And just when I thought the tapestry was finished. They locked the cottage and took the locket back to the vicarage hall. There, among the case papers, Miss Marple leafed through the photographs and lists of names until she found a mention. Margaret Llewellyn, deceased wife of Gareth Llewellyn, died in Little Bramble while visiting family at Rose Cottage. The date was over 4 decades past. So, Craddock said slowly, the cottage belonged to her people. That would make sense of Llewellyn's continued interest. And perhaps, Miss Marple added, there was some matter of inheritance or scandal, something Miss Dunn believed could be revived. People will go to extraordinary lengths to keep the past from touching the present. By the following day, confirmation had come from Cardiff. The woman in the locket was indeed Margaret Llewellyn. Her death had been ruled accidental, a fall in the garden. But there had been quiet whispers of an argument with her husband before she left Cardiff. No proof, no charges, just the kind of story a family learns not to tell outside its own walls. Miss Marple, hearing this, merely nodded. Then the papers Miss Dunn obtained may have been more than financial. They could have held letters, diaries, anything that tied Llewellyn, and perhaps others, to events that were never meant to see daylight. In that case, the blackmail had a double edge. Money, yes, but also reputation. Craddock exhaled. Well, at least this confirms why Llewellyn kept paying Bancroft to keep an eye on the place, and why Miss Dunn was living on borrowed time from the day she arrived. That evening, Miss Marple walked past Rose Cottage one last time. The roses were dropping their petals now, pale against the dark soil. She paused at the gate, her gloved hand resting lightly on the wood. Behind her, the village green lay quiet, the lamps just beginning to glow. It struck her, as it often did at the close of such matters, that the solution to a mystery rarely left the air any lighter. Justice might be done, but lives had still been twisted, ended, or altered forever. Miss Dunn, with her neat hand and her careful manners, had come to Little Bramble thinking she could outplay 2 men accustomed to secrets. Instead, she had uncovered an older grief, one that had waited patiently in the shadows until it could harm again. As she turned toward home, she heard footsteps approaching, light, quick ones. Ivy Glass appeared out of the mist, shawl drawn tight. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice low but steady. "If you hadn't made me speak that day at tea, I think I'd still be looking over my shoulder." Miss Marple smiled gently. "You'll do well, my dear. Just remember, people will often try to make you believe you've seen nothing at all. But you have. And that is sometimes the only difference between safety and danger." They walked together as far as the corner, where Ivy turned off toward Mrs. Quayle's. Miss Marple continued on, the evening cool on her face, her mind already turning to the small rhythms of the next day. Letters to write, a cake to bake for the church sale, and the last of the dahlias to cut before frost. For now, at least, Little Bramble was quiet again. But she knew, as she always did, that human nature would find some new mischief to make, and that when it did, the village's peace would once more be nothing but a veil, as thin and as easily torn as a lace curtain. A week later, the first real frost of the season lay over Little Bramble. Lawns sparkled white under the early light, the air crisp enough to sting the lungs. Miss Marple, bundled in a wool shawl, was up before most, feeding the birds in her small garden and watching her breath drift in clouds. It was the kind of morning when sounds carry far. The crack of a milk bottle on a doorstep, the clop of a cart horse on the lane, the faint strike of the church clock. By now, the case of Rose Cottage was officially closed. Bancroft's formal confession had been taken down in the county court, and Lockett's complicity, while lacking enough for a full murder charge, was enough to end his respectable standing. Llewellyn in Cardiff was under investigation, the old land frauds being aired in the city papers with a relish only distance in years could bring. To most in Little Bramble, the matter was a sealed chapter. But Miss Marple, who knew how often endings were only polite fictions, sensed there was still one small knot left in the cord. Inspector Craddock confirmed it when he came round that morning, his boots leaving a scatter of frost on her mat. "Everything's signed, sealed, and sent off," he said, accepting her offer of tea. "Except for one question no one can quite account for." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, pouring. "There always is one." "It's the locket," Craddock said. "We know it belonged to Margaret Llewellyn, and we know it ended up hidden in the rose pot. But neither Bancroft nor Lockett admits to having put it there, and Ivy swears she's never seen it before. So who hid it, and why?" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "You recall, Inspector, what Mrs. Maplethorpe said about seeing a man's shadow behind the lace curtains at Rose Cottage the day of Miss Dunn's death? And how that would have been impossible with the blinds drawn. It struck me at the time that she may have been right about the shadow, but wrong about the timing. What if she saw it not on the day of the murder, but the day before?" Craddock frowned. "You think someone was in the cottage earlier than we thought?" "I do. And someone who had a sentimental reason to return the locket to where it had once been. In a village, such acts of sentiment are rarely about love. They're about guilt. I believe the locket was put there by a person who had kept it for years, but who feared it might be linked to an old death. And I think Miss Dunn's digging into the past prompted them to hide it again, somewhere they thought no one would look." "But who?" Miss Marple gave him a mild smile. "Why, the vicar's wife, of course." Craddock blinked. "Mrs. Jameson? She grew up in Little Bramble, you know, in the house next to Rose Cottage. She would have been a girl when Margaret Llewellyn died there. And she told me herself that Miss Dunn had come to ask about potted roses for the fete. That is not the sort of detail one volunteers unless it has some personal significance." Craddock was silent for a moment, then gave a low whistle. "And you think she kept the locket all these years?" "I think it was given to her by Margaret Llewellyn, perhaps in confidence, perhaps just before her death. A young woman might well give a keepsake to a friendly girl next door, especially if she suspected trouble. But when Miss Dunn started asking questions about Rose Cottage's past, Mrs. Jameson realized the locket could become awkward evidence, particularly if anyone thought Margaret's death had been less than accidental. Not that it changes the main facts of this case," Craddock said slowly. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But it matters to those who have carried the weight of a secret for 40 years. Mrs. Jameson did no harm in the present matter, and the locket is not proof of anything that could be brought to law. Sometimes, Inspector, it is better to let certain truths remain only half-spoken." Craddock gave her a searching look. "You're not going to tell her we've guessed?" "I shall tell her only that the locket is safe," Miss Marple said serenely. "That will be enough." They finished their tea in companionable silence, the fire crackling softly. When Craddock left, Miss Marple stood a while at the window, watching him walk away across the frosted green. She thought of Margaret Llewellyn, of Miss Dunn, of all the quiet dramas that had played out in and around Rose Cottage over the years. The house had stood through it all, absorbing secrets into its walls like rain into old stone. Later that afternoon, she did, in fact, call on Mrs. Jameson. They sat in the vicarage drawing room, the tea things set out as usual, the autumn light falling through the tall windows. Miss Marple produced the locket from her reticule and set it gently on the table between them. "It was found in the garden at Rose Cottage," she said. "I thought you might like to know it will be kept somewhere safe now." Mrs. Jameson's fingers hesitated, then closed around the locket. For a moment her face softened into something younger, almost girlish. "It belonged to a friend," she said quietly. "A very long time ago." Miss Marple only nodded. No further explanation was needed. When she returned home, the lamps in the cottages were beginning to glow, the air rich with the smell of suppers cooking. She paused at her own gate, listening to the everyday sounds of the village. The distant bark of a dog, the rattle of a coal scuttle, the laughter of children chasing each other home. All of it the same as it had been before Rose Cottage's shadow fell across Little Bramble, and yet subtly not the same at all. For in every village, she knew, the surface was only ever that, a surface. Beneath it ran the deep, unchanging currents of human nature: ambition, jealousy, greed, love, guilt. They were as perennial as the roses in the cottage garden, and as certain to bloom again when the season was right. She went inside, set the kettle on, and reached for her knitting. Somewhere in the wool bag was a half-finished scarf for her niece. Somewhere in the village, another story was already beginning to weave itself. And when it came, quietly as they always did, she would be ready to pick up the thread. For now, though, the evening was hers, and Little Bramble lay peaceful under the frost, as if nothing dark had ever happened there at all. The first week of November brought with it a restless wind, sending the last of the leaves skittering across the cobbled high street and rattling the bare branches against cottage windows. The Harvest Fete Committee had begun its meetings in earnest at the vicarage hall, and the village, determined to put the Rose Cottage business behind it, busied itself with preparations, raffle prizes, cake stalls, and the ever-contentious question of who would judge the preserves. Miss Marple attended these gatherings, sitting quietly with her knitting while others debated. She had a gift for making herself appear an amiable background presence, yet her pale blue eyes missed little. The glances exchanged across the table, the sharpness with which certain names were spoken. The case may have been closed in the eyes of the law, but in the subtle theater of village life, its aftershocks were still playing out. It was during one such meeting that she noticed Ivy Glass slip in late, cheeks flushed from the wind, and take a seat at the far end of the hall. Mrs. Quayle gave her a tight nod, then turned back to her notes, but Ivy kept her gaze down, contributing nothing. When the meeting adjourned, she lingered until most had left before making her way to Miss Marple. "May I walk with you?" she asked. They took the path along the green, the wind tugging at their skirts. Ivy was silent for a time, then said abruptly, "I've had a letter." Miss Marple looked at her, though her pace did not change. "From whom?" "There's no name, just a single line. You've been lucky once, don't make it twice." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her mind sharpened. "When did you receive this?" "This morning. It was pushed under the shop door before we opened." Ivy's voice dropped. "Do you think it's connected to before?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that whoever sent it wishes you to believe that. The question is whether they are warning you away from something new or merely stirring the embers of the old? Ivy gave a small, nervous laugh. I've not done anything worth warning about. Miss Marple said nothing, but she thought of Ivy's position. Young, observant, with a knack for being in the wrong place at the right time. Some people, once frightened, become the perfect vessels for others' mischief. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a note to Inspector Craddock, suggesting a discreet word with Mrs. Quayle about anyone seen near the shop that morning. She also asked him to look into a matter in Cardiff, not about Llewellyn or Bancroft, but about the former clerk who had supplied Miss Dunn with her papers. Craddock, used to her oblique requests, sent back a brief reply. On it. 2 days later, the wind dropped, leaving the village wrapped in a damp stillness. Miss Marple was in her garden pruning the last of the roses when Craddock appeared at the gate. You were right, he said without preamble. That former clerk, name of Henry Small, came into a bit of money last year. No one seems to know from where. And he's got a nephew working as a delivery boy in Barrow End. Matches the description Mrs. Quayle gave of a lad loitering near her shop the morning Ivy's note appeared. Miss Marple laid her secateurs on the wall. So we may suppose that someone, perhaps in Cardiff, still takes an interest in little Bramble's affairs. And that interest is sufficient to send a warning. Craddock nodded. But why target Ivy now? Because, Miss Marple said, she is the only one left here who might be persuaded, willingly or otherwise, to carry a message or conceal something. The others are too watched, too compromised. Ivy has youth, mobility, and the appearance of innocence. Dangerous qualities, if one wishes to use another as a pawn. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Ivy to tea. She set out her best china and the plate of seed cake Ivy had once said she liked. The conversation began with harmless talk, the fete, Mrs. Quayle's orders, the state of the weather. But gradually Miss Marple steered it toward the letter. My dear, she said gently, have you thought that the person who sent it may not mean you harm at all? Ivy blinked. Then why send it? To frighten you into obedience, Miss Marple replied. It is easier to direct someone who is unsettled than someone who feels safe. Ivy's brow furrowed. But direct me to do what? That, Miss Marple said, is what we must discover before they ask it. Over the next week, Miss Marple kept a discreet watch. She noticed Ivy taking longer routes home, sometimes stopping at the edge of the green as if expecting to meet someone. Once, she saw her speaking to a man in a brown coat near the mill lane. When spotted, the man tipped his hat and walked away at a brisk pace. Miss Marple mentioned this to Craddock, who set constable tapping to make casual inquiries. The man turned out to be a commercial traveler in household goods. Legitimate enough on the surface, but with a route that took him regularly between Cardiff and the neighboring villages. On the morning of the fete, the matter came to a quiet head. The hall was alive with bustle, ladies arranging tables, children darting between stalls. Miss Marple had taken her usual post near the cake table, ostensibly minding the Victoria sponges. When she saw Ivy slip out the side door, her shawl pulled tight. A moment later, the man in the brown coat detached himself from the edge of the crowd and followed. Miss Marple moved without hurry, but with purpose, catching Craddock's eye as she passed. They went out together, keeping to the shelter of the hedgerow. Down by the mill stream, they saw Ivy and the man, standing close. He handed her a small parcel. She hesitated, then tucked it into her basket. Craddock stepped forward. I think we'll see what's in that parcel. The man bolted, but tapping, appearing as if by magic from the next lane, intercepted him neatly. Ivy, pale and wide-eyed, surrendered the package. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a bundle of folded documents. Copies of deeds and letters, some in Llewellyn's hand, others in Bancroft's. Miss Marple examined them briefly. Ah, the rest of Miss Dunn's collection, hidden away no doubt when things became too hot in Cardiff. And now someone thought to smuggle them back into the village, using our Ivy as the unwitting courier. But why bring them here? Craddock asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because there is one more person, Inspector, who still fears these papers might be found, and who might be persuaded to pay for their quiet destruction. Secrets are a currency, and they change hands many times before their value is spent. In the end, the man in the brown coat admitted he had been paid by Henry Small to deliver the packet to an address in Little Bramble, an address that, when checked, proved to be an empty property once managed by Lockett. The chain of old deceit, it seemed, still had a few rusty links. The fate went on, the cakes were judged, and Miss Marple's Victoria sponge took second place to Mrs. Lorimer's. Ivy, released from suspicion, carried on as before, though with a new wariness in her eyes. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, a plate of seed cake beside her, and reflected on how the echoes of Rose Cottage had lasted longer than most would have guessed. Crimes, she thought, were like seeds themselves. Dropped into the soil of human weakness, they might lie dormant for years, waiting for the right season to sprout. And when they did, they brought forth a tangle that could not be cleared in a single harvest. Little Bramble slept peacefully under the November moon, but Miss Marple, watching from her parlor window, knew the peace was only as deep as the next root waiting to push its way to the surface. By mid-November, the village had begun to turn toward winter. The last of the leaves clung stubbornly to the beech trees along the lane, and the air had that faint scent of coal smoke and damp earth that marked the season. Frost now came most mornings, silvering the hedgerows and leaving the grass crisp underfoot until the sun rose high enough to soften it. Rose Cottage, once the focus of every eye, had taken on a different sort of silence. The crooked gate had been repaired, the shutters opened during the day, and the owners had sent word that it would be let again in the spring. Still, the villagers passed it a little quicker than they did other houses, as if unwilling to tempt whatever fate had hovered over it before. Miss Marple, however, passed it without the faintest hesitation. She believed in caution, yes, but she believed far more firmly in the steadying effect of treating a place as part of the ordinary pattern of life. On one such morning, she paused at the gate to admire the pruning work done to the roses, noting how the bare canes had been neatly tied against the trellis. It was the sort of small, ordered detail that suggested an intention to move forward. Inspector Craddock appeared from the bend in the lane, his overcoat buttoned to the chin. "Morning, Miss Marple. I was just coming to see you." She smiled. "Then I've saved you a few steps." They walked together toward her cottage, their breath curling in the frosty air. Craddock explained that the papers recovered during the fete, the last remnants of Miss Dunn's collection, had been sent to Cardiff for the inquiry there. The commercial traveler in the brown coat had given a full statement implicating Henry Small in their concealment, though the man maintained he had only been keeping them safe for an unnamed client. "Unnamed," Miss Marple murmured, "but not unknown to him. That sort of discretion is rarely for its own sake. There will be a payment behind it, of course. Perhaps more than one. Cardiff police are still unraveling that part," Craddock said. "But between Bancroft, Lockett, and Llewellyn, the whole web's starting to show. Llewellyn's health isn't good. They say he's been confined to his rooms these past weeks. Could be the strain. Or the removal of the one thing that kept him feeling safe. Miss Marple said. Men like Mr. Llewellyn mistake the silence of others for security. Once that silence is broken, they hear noise in every corner. They reached her gate, and Craddock paused. There's another thing. Ivy Glass has had no more mysterious visitors. But Mrs. Quayle says she's been quieter than ever. I think the whole business shook her more than she'll admit. Then, Miss Marple said, we must find her something wholesome to occupy her mind. A young woman who has been used by others needs to see herself as useful on her own terms. Over the next week, Miss Marple made it her business to ensure Ivy was drawn into the preparations for the church's Christmas bazaar. She arranged for the girl to help with the decorative sewing for the stalls, praising her skill to anyone within earshot. Slowly, Ivy began to regain her usual lightness, though the habit of glancing over her shoulder lingered. Meanwhile, the village gossip shifted to other matters. The health of Mrs. Maplethorpe's sister in Devon, the rumor of a new schoolmaster at the parish school, the early arrival of snowdrops in Mrs. Lorimer's garden. Only occasionally did the talk circle back to Rose Cottage, and then, in the softened tones of a story, being absorbed into the long memory of the place. It was one such evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, that Mrs. Jameson called. The vicar's wife was brisk as ever, but there was a certain care in her manner as she produced a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I've been meaning to bring you this," she said. "It's the locket. I've decided I'd rather it was in your safekeeping than mine." Miss Marple took it without surprise, her fingers closing over the familiar weight. "Are you quite sure?" Mrs. Jameson nodded. "Yes, I've kept it long enough. Margaret Llewellyn was kind to me when I was a girl, but there's nothing to be gained by holding on to it now. You'll know what to do." They sat together for a while, speaking of the upcoming bazaar and the state of the church roof. When Mrs. Jameson left, Miss Marple remained by the fire, the locket in her lap. She opened it once more, studying the tiny photograph, the curl of hair. Whatever the true story behind it, the locket was a relic of a sorrow long past, yet still capable of stirring the present. She decided it would be best given to the Llewellyn family through the Cardiff authorities, with no note beyond a line that it had been found at Rose Cottage. Some things, she thought, were better left without explanation. The following days passed in a comfortable quiet. Miss Marple found herself once again observing the village in its ordinary state. Arguments over market prices, the mild rivalry between bakers, the delight of children at the first frost sturdy enough to crunch underfoot. Yet she knew that beneath the surface, the undercurrents remained, as they always did. One afternoon, while she was choosing fabric for the bazaar stall, she overheard two women in the draper's discussing a letter someone had received from Cardiff, offering to buy an old property in the district for a very fair price. Miss Marple's ears pricked. Though the women did not say the name, the description of the property matched one formerly managed by Lockett. She made a mental note and, that evening, mentioned it to Craddock when he stopped by. His expression sharpened. That could mean someone is trying to recover land tied to the old fraud. If they're buying rather than selling, it might be an attempt to clean the record before the inquiry catches up, Miss Marple agreed. "It seems, Inspector, that even when the larger scheme is broken, the smaller schemes scurry out to salvage what they can, like mice after a cupboard has been opened." Craddock promised to look into it, though he warned her it might lead to nothing more than a speculative investor. Still, Miss Marple knew from long experience that such threads were rarely unconnected to the larger weave. The bazaar came and went in a whirl of stalls, raffles, and the cheerful chaos of a village gathering. Ivy's embroidery was much admired, and she won a modest prize for her hand-stitched tablecloth, Mrs. Lorimer took home the largest cake, Mrs. Maplethorpe the knitted blanket, and the church roof fund gained a respectable sum. As the evening wound down, Miss Marple stood in the doorway of the hall, watching the villagers drift away under the lamplight. She thought of how swiftly the extraordinary becomes ordinary, given enough time and enough tea. The shadow over Rose Cottage had lifted, at least for now, but the memory of it would linger. Quiet, folded into the fabric of village life, ready to be brought out only when the right combination of names and places prompted its telling. Back at her own cottage, she set the kettle on once more and took up her knitting. Outside, the frost was already forming on the lane, and the air was sharp with winter's promise. She allowed herself a small smile. The business of Rose Cottage was, at last, laid to rest in the way that mattered most. Not in the courts, nor in the newspapers, but in the hearts and conversations of Little Bramble, where it would now live only as another of those stories one hears over seed cake and sherry on long winter evenings. Still, she kept the locket in her writing desk until she could post it to Cardiff, because Miss Marple believed in finishing things properly, and when it was gone, she would return entirely to the daily, quiet work of observing, listening, and waiting. For in a place like Little Bramble, the next story was never far away. The first snow came at the end of November, soft and steady, turning the thatched roofs of Little Bramble into sugared domes and muffling the sounds of the lane. Children's laughter rang out as they packed snow into uneven shapes, while the older villagers moved more cautiously, sweeping steps and scattering ash on the icy patches. Miss Marple, however, enjoyed the snow. It slowed the village down, giving her more time to observe as people lingered in doorways or paused in conversation beside the green. With Rose Cottage still empty, the stretch of lane leading past it seemed quieter than ever. She sometimes took that way to the post office, partly for the exercise and partly because it let her see who else might be passing by. One morning, returning from such a walk, she was met at her gate by Inspector Craddock, who was wrapped in a thick scarf and wore an expression she recognized immediately. The look of a man who thought a case closed, only to find a seam splitting open again. "We've had word from Cardiff," he said without preamble. The locket reached the Llewellyn family. No letter, just as you suggested. But 2 days later, someone tried to break into the solicitor's office that's handling Llewellyn's affairs, forced the back window, rifled one of the desks, but nothing seems to have been taken. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Or nothing the staff knew to look for. "Quite," Craddock said. "The odd thing is, the only desk disturbed belonged to a junior clerk who's been cataloging the Llewellyn papers for the inquiry. And that desk did hold one envelope connected to Margaret Llewellyn's death, a packet of letters between her and an unknown correspondent here in Little Bramble, dated the weeks before she died." "That," Miss Marple murmured, "is not odd at all. If someone feared those letters might shed new light on an old accident, they would want them gone before the inquiry thought to connect them." Craddock glanced at her. "You think the death wasn't an accident, don't you?" "I think," she said carefully, "that 40 years ago in Little Bramble, a young woman may have found herself entangled in a situation she could neither endure nor escape. And in such situations, Inspector, the cause of death is often decided less by the moment than by all the moments that led to it. Snow fell harder that afternoon, and by evening the village was blanketed. Miss Marple sat by the fire, the locket's absence making the space in her writing desk feel oddly bare. She thought about Margaret Llewellyn, about Miss Dunn's determination, about the stubborn persistence of secrets. There was a connection here, one more thread, that bound the past to the present. 2 days later, her chance to tug at that thread came. Mrs. Jameson called, ostensibly to bring a basket of scones from the vicarage. But she lingered by the fire, her hands busy with her gloves. "I hear from Mrs. Maplethorpe that you've been talking about Margaret Llewellyn again," she said lightly. "I've been listening," Miss Marple corrected gently. "People say she was often at the vicarage in her last weeks." Mrs. Jameson hesitated. "She came for advice. My father-in-law was the vicar then. She was unhappy in Cardiff, but she didn't want to go back to her family. There was talk she might stay in Little Bramble. That didn't suit her husband, of course." Miss Marple watched her closely. "And yet, the day before her death, she gave you the locket." Mrs. Jameson's eyes flickered. "She said she wanted someone to keep it safe. I didn't ask why. I was young, and one doesn't question such things." "One might," Miss Marple said softly, "if one suspected she feared for her safety." There was a pause. Then Mrs. Jameson said, "If you're asking whether her death was truly an accident, I can't tell you. I only know that when I heard she'd fallen in the garden, I thought, not surprise, but dread, as if something I had feared had finally happened." When she left, Miss Marple sat for a long time, considering. The past was like snow. It could cover the ground completely, but beneath it, the contours remained. Craddock came the next morning, stamping snow from his boots. "We've traced those letters from Margaret Llewellyn. They were to a woman here in Little Bramble, Mrs. Agnes Lorimer." Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "Mrs. Lorimer has lived here her whole life, and she has a sharp eye for other people's business. I wonder that she never mentioned this." "She claims she barely knew Margaret," Craddock said. "Says the letters must have been about some parish matter." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Mrs. Lorimer's memory is as selective as her charity. If she kept those letters, she knew their value. And if she didn't, someone else in her household might have." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Lorimer, bearing a jar of quince jelly. Over tea, she mentioned the snow, the bazaar, and finally, quite casually, the name of Margaret Llewellyn. Mrs. Lorimer's expression tightened for only a moment. "Poor thing. Pretty in a pale sort of way. I recall she liked to walk by the mill. Said it reminded her of somewhere in Cardiff." "Did she confide in you?" Miss Marple asked. "Not particularly, though she once left an envelope with me for safekeeping. Said she'd collect it later, but she never did." "And what became of it?" Mrs. Lorimer sipped her tea. "I can't recall. It was years ago. Might have been mislaid." But Miss Marple, noting the faint tremor in her hand, suspected otherwise. People rarely forget what they have kept hidden. They only pretend to. Leaving the house, she found herself looking once more toward Rose Cottage. The snow lay thick on its roof, the garden a smooth white quilt. Somewhere beneath it, she felt, the last piece of the puzzle was still buried, not in the literal soil, but in the hearts of those who had lived through that earlier winter when Margaret Llewellyn's life had ended. That evening, as she wrote a short note to Craddock, she realized the investigation into Rose Cottage had become something more than a single case. It had become a map of how the past, even when partially erased, could shape every path taken in the present. And Miss Marple, with the patience of someone who knew how to read such maps, was content to follow its lines a little further, until the last drift melted and the ground beneath showed its true shape. The thaw began in early December, the snow retreating in uneven patches from the hedgerows and leaving the green a patchwork of damp earth and frost-bitten grass. The lanes grew muddy, the air heavy with the smell of wet leaves, and the drip-drip from cottage eaves marked the slow release of winter's hold. In Little Bramble. The villagers prepared for Christmas with their usual blend of thrift and pride. Paper chains were strung across shop windows, the church's holly wreath hung over the lich gate, and the vicarage parlor smelled constantly of spice from the fruitcakes cooling on its sideboard. Miss Marple, making her way to the post office one morning, carried herself as she always did, quietly observant, with a faint smile that could mean anything. She paused to greet Mrs. Maplethorpe, who was directing the delivery of a crate of oranges for the school children, and exchanged a few mild words with Mr. Pritchard, the milkman, about the lateness of the frost. It was the sort of morning in which all appeared well, and yet her mind was not wholly at ease. Inspector Craddock had sent word the night before. The inquiry in Cardiff had turned up one more anomaly. Among the Llewellyn papers recovered from the break-in at the solicitor's office was a small note, undated, unsigned, written in a woman's hand. It contained only 6 words. He knows about the garden path. Miss Marple understood at once that this was no casual remark. Garden path could mean the literal path at Rose Cottage, the scene of Margaret Llewellyn's death. Or it could be a cipher between 2 people who feared speaking plainly. Either way, it suggested that someone besides Margaret had anticipated danger and perhaps tried to warn her. Later that day, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Jameson at the vicarage, ostensibly to deliver a small jar of marmalade. They sat in the parlor with their tea, the fire giving off a gentle heat. "You knew Margaret Llewellyn well in her last weeks," Miss Marple began. "Do you recall if she ever mentioned the garden path?" Mrs. Jameson's knitting paused. "Yes, once. She said she disliked walking there alone after dusk. She laughed about it, but I thought she meant it." "And did she say why?" Mrs. Jameson shook her head. "Number. But I remember the day before she died. She told me she might write a letter that evening, just in case. I suppose she never did, or it never reached anyone." Miss Marple left the vicarage deep in thought. The phrase nagged at her. The garden path at Rose Cottage was narrow, bordered by high hedges that could conceal a person easily. If Margaret had felt uneasy there, perhaps it was because she had once met someone she did not expect, or someone she feared. 2 mornings later, Miss Marple's suspicions took shape. She was crossing the green when she saw Mrs. Lorimer standing by the church notice board, speaking in low tones to a man in a heavy overcoat. She recognized him instantly from Craddock's description. The junior clerk from the Cardiff solicitor's office, the very one whose desk had been rifled. They parted quickly when they saw her. The man walked briskly toward the lane to the station, while Mrs. Lorimer busied herself with adjusting her gloves. "Cold morning," Miss Marple remarked, as she approached. Mrs. Lorimer gave a tight smile. "Indeed. Just giving directions to a stranger." "Ah," Miss Marple said mildly. "Strangers are so interesting. They often know more of a place than the place knows of them." That evening, she wrote to Craddock, urging him to question the clerk. By the next afternoon, he was at her door with the result. The clerk had admitted meeting Mrs. Lorimer twice before, both times to exchange envelopes, one containing the recovered Llewellyn letters, the other a sum of cash. "She says it was payment for some old debt," Craddock told her. "But she won't say what the debt was or to whom it was owed. And there's no proof she had anything to do with the break-in." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said. "But if she held letters from Margaret Llewellyn for 40 years, she knew precisely what they meant. And I think one of them contained that phrase about the garden path." Craddock's brow furrowed, which would mean she knew Margaret was in danger. "Yes," Miss Marple replied quietly. "But knowing and acting are 2 different things. Perhaps she thought it was not her affair, Or perhaps she thought she could use it someday, if the need arose. That day came when Miss Dunn began asking questions. The last days before Christmas passed in a flurry of small excitements. The church choir practiced carols in the chilly nave, shopkeepers set out baskets of nuts and dried fruit, and the children rehearsed their parts for the nativity play. On Christmas Eve, Miss Marple stood at her window as the first stars appeared, watching the glow of lanterns bobbing along the lane as villagers made their way to the evening service. The case of Rose Cottage, in its many twists and shadows, had wound itself into the fabric of the village's year, altering it in ways that might not be seen until much later. She thought of Margaret Llewellyn, of Miss Dunn, of Ivy Glass, and even of Mrs. Lorimer, each caught in her own way on the garden path of human weakness and fear. She thought of how easy it was for the truth to be stepped around, like a puddle in the lane, until someone, by choice or by chance, set a foot directly in it. The church bells began to peal, their sound rich in the cold air. Miss Marple smiled faintly, drew her shawl closer, and prepared to join the service. Some things, she knew, must be left to the passage of time. The garden path would frost over, thaw, and grow green again. The cottage would have new occupants by spring, and the village would fold this story into its store of winter tales, told and retold until fact and fancy were comfortably entwined. As she stepped into the crisp night, she felt the quiet satisfaction of work completed, not in the sense of police files closed, but in the subtler way of seeing each piece settle into its place. The truth, in all its shades, had been found, and it would live now where it belonged, in memory, where it could do no more harm. January came in with hard frosts and skies so clear they seemed almost brittle. Little Bramble had resumed its slow, comfortable rhythm. Postman's whistle at 10, the grocer's van twice a week, church bells on Sundays. But the matter of Rose Cottage had never entirely left the village's undercurrent. There was still, Miss Marple knew, a last stone to be turned. Inspector Craddock arrived one afternoon, his breath clouding in the cold. "We've finished in Cardiff," he said. "And you were right from the start." The letters from Margaret Llewellyn to Mrs. Lorimer were the key. One of them spoke of a meeting on the garden path with someone who had information about her husband's dealings. That someone was Locket's father. Miss Marple's knitting paused. Ah, so the connection was not merely professional. It was generational. Craddock nodded. The elder Locket feared she might use what she knew. 2 days later she was dead. No proof enough for a charge after all these years. But the pattern is there. Mrs. Lorimer kept the letters as insurance. When Miss Dunn started asking questions, she saw her chance to profit again, passing them on quietly through the solicitor's clerk. And that, in turn, drew the attention of Bancroft, who thought the papers might expose him and Llewellyn. Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. So Miss Dunn stumbled into an old web, still sticky enough to catch her. The strands were greed, fear, and an inheritance of silence, each clinging to the next. Craddock looked faintly troubled, and Mrs. Lorimer walks away untouched. "She will not walk far," Miss Marple said gently. "Reputations in a village are like embroidery. One pulled thread can make the whole pattern slacken. She will find herself, little by little, left out of confidences, omitted from committees. That will be punishment enough for one who lives on the currency of being well informed." Over the next weeks, the thaw set in, and with it came small signs of renewal. The snowdrops by the churchyard wall pushed through the softening soil. Rose Cottage's shutters were opened for the first time in months as workmen aired its rooms. The owners, it was said, planned to let it to a retired couple from the coast, strangers to the village, and to its recent history. Ivy Glass, too, seemed lighter. She had taken on more work at Mrs. Quayle's, her head bent over fine stitches with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had regained control over her own days. Once, catching sight of Miss Marple in the shop doorway, she smiled. A real smile, free of the wary glance that had become habit. One evening, as the last of the winter sun burned low over the green, Miss Marple walked past Rose Cottage. The garden was bare but neat, the rose canes tied in readiness for spring. She paused at the gate, not in hesitation, but in reflection. The cottage had seen more than one winter shadow, but it had also, each time, endured to greet the spring. The truth of what had happened, both 40 years ago and in the weeks just past, would never be told in full beyond the small circle of those who needed to know. But that was as it should be. Not all truths, she thought, were meant for the wide light of day. Some belonged in the quieter light of understanding, where they could be seen without being brandished. She turned away at last, her step steady on the lane's thawing gravel. There would be other cases, other puzzles. Human nature, she knew, provided them in an endless supply. But for now, the matter of Rose Cottage was complete. Its last knot untied, its last thread woven into the larger tapestry of village life. In the drawing room of her neat little house, she set the kettle to boil and picked up her knitting. Outside, the frost was already beginning to creep back over the green, the evening settling into stillness. Miss Marple smiled to herself. In Little Bramble, peace was always only ever temporary. But, for the moment, it was peace all the same.